Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is your lesson series on the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now this is one of the most popular immigration programs, and of course it's going to play a role in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So we'll take a look at some of those common themes and tricks to look out for, and of course we will do simulation questions to really help put all of the information into practice. So I really hope you're going to enjoy your lesson today. This one is a pretty tough one. I'm talking about the topic, of course. Now the topic itself, in terms of economic streams, I would say that the Federal Skilled Worker Program is the most difficult one. So when you're thinking of the Canadian Experience Class and Federal Skilled Trades Program and the IIVC and Self-Employed, I would say that the Federal Skilled Worker Program has the most little tricky areas in it. So we're going to go through this very thoroughly today, and by the end of this lesson, of course, you're going to have a really great understanding of what to look out for in this topic in terms of passing your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now, part of the reason why this one is so tricky is because you have an extra step in this. So, as you know, by understanding the express entry procedures, that will solve about half of the issues for you. Now, with the Federal Skilled Worker Program, you have to understand the definition of this, of course, and also the points system that is used in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And that, again, is, of course, before a person can go into the express entry pool of candidates, as we'll see in a minute. So with this one here, there are quite a few little tricky areas because you have the definitions requirements, of course, but then you also have the extra series of points that are needed in order for someone to immigrate under this program. So let's take a look just quickly again at those procedures that are needed in order for someone to immigrate under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So first of all, they need to create that profile in Express Entry. Now the very, very, very important part is here in step 2. So remember that people need to meet those requirements of the Skilled Worker Program, Skilled Trades, or Canadian Experience Class in order to move into that express entry pool of candidates. However, if someone's going to immigrate under the Federal Skilled Worker Program, they would only move into this pool if they meet the requirements, of course, and we'll see that that means in terms of education, language, and work experience, but also these points. So the person would need a minimum of 67 points in the Federal Skilled Worker Points system. Now this is different from the CRS points that come into play in Part 3 of the Express Entry Procedures. Of course, the person gets a points assessment in CRS, but it's really important to remember that the Federal Skilled Worker Points system, now that's 67 as a minimum out of 100 possible points, and that system is different from the CRS points. So once those 67 points are met and the person meets those minimum requirements, and if he receives a CRS score, that score doesn't really relate to the 67 points. They're giving different points in different areas. So you'd want to think that the 67 points is one of those requirements under the skilled worker class, and that once a person gets a CRS score, those 67 points don't really matter anymore. And remember, as a final step, the person would receive an ITA to apply for permanent residency through the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So if you're watching this on the website, you have all the links right here. So you'd want to work your way through these links. And you have, of course, court cases on the bottom here. So those are really important to read because it's really going to help you to see all of this information in the context of real-life scenarios. The Federal Skilled Worker Program is actually the best one for court cases and court decisions. So it's really, really great that you can read through a lot of court cases in order to better understand this topic. So let's take a look at those general requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now in here you have quite a few little elements. You have those common elements, just like in any other economic stream of immigration. Of course, the proof of funds is needed. If a person has a qualifying job offer, he or she does not need to prove that. Remember, the person cannot intend to live in Quebec. In this case here, for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the minimum score is a CLB 7. So this is the highest score needed. If you remember from the Canadian Experience class lesson, that it's the same score, except if a person is immigrating under a NOC B profession in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the minimum score that he or she would need in the language exams would be a CLB 7. If the person is going under the Federal Skilled Trades Program, for example, that would be a CLB 5. Or if the person's going under the Canadian Experience class under a NOC B position, that person would need a CLB 5. However, in the Federal Skilled Trades Program, Federal Skilled Worker Program, and the Canadian Experience class, as we saw before, if a person's immigrating under a NOC OA position in the Canadian Experience class, or immigrating under a NOC OAB position in the Federal Skilled Worker stream, it's a CLB 7. This person here needs to have only 1 year of paid skilled work experience. We'll take a look at what is meant by that in detail as we carry on in the lesson. This one has an educational requirement. So some of the other programs we've seen did not have an educational requirement, but this one does. Now at a minimum, the person would need a high school diploma. And now that high school diploma has to be Canadian, or he or she can have a foreign equivalent if it's ECA verified. We'll take a look at this little section in detail too, because it might play a role in your exam. And then we have that extra step of those points. So if those minimum requirements are met, then they would move on to to do a points assessment. And that points assessment, of course, would have to show that the person meets the minimum requirements, which would be 67 out of 100. We're going to do a different lesson on the points system used in here, just like what we usually do, where we'll go through it really step by step, because then if anything like that comes up on your exam, you'll be able to handle it pretty easily. And finally, just like everything else, if a person meets the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program, that doesn't mean that they're going to receive PR, because they need to meet the CRS cutoff. All right, so let's take a look at the language requirements for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now, just a little bit of advice for all of you. I know when we get the feedback for these lessons, I know everybody's real happy with the lessons, and that makes us really happy as well. So thanks for, of course, all the great feedback that we get from all of you. And something that people want us to discuss a little bit more is beyond the exam, really. So life as an RCIC. So I'm going to try to bring this up as much as I can in these lessons here. And this one, the Federal Skilled Worker Program, is, I think, a great place to begin with this, or to add in some information about your life after you pass the exam and when you become an RCIC. So the Federal Skilled Worker Program will probably form the foundation of your business. When you're recruiting people from overseas, or when you're advertising overseas for clients, and you're looking for people with a great profile to see if there's an opportunity for them to immigrate, often you're looking for people who qualify for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. A very big part of this is, of course, being able to obtain that CLB 7 level in their exam. So on my side, for example, most of our clients, well, we need them to get that CLB 7 before we can even begin exploring immigration options for them. So the Federal Skilled Worker Program, like I said, if you're starting to think a little bit beyond the exam and where you're going to focus your business, the Federal Skilled Worker Program is a fantastic area to cover. But those language requirements are extremely important. So we can see the ones over here. So we can see that IELTS, it's a band 6 and everything for IELTS. For CELPIP, it's 7 and everything. For TEF, you're looking at 310 to 348 with writing and speaking, and a 249 to 279 in listening, a 207 to 232 in reading, and then with TCF, so TCF's the one that the exam that was recently accepted by the IRCC, we're looking at a 10 or 11 in writing and speaking, and a 458 to 502 in listening. Reading is a 453 to 498. All right, so like I said, it's important to start thinking a little bit beyond the exam. I mean, you're doing all the work, you're obviously digging into the lessons quite a bit, and once you start, I hope you're getting excited actually to start thinking about the future. Well, part of the future for all of you is really the Federal Skilled Worker Program and helping make sure that your clients can obtain that CLB 7 level. So if you're looking for a partnership as well to make sure your clients can obtain that level, be sure to check out the partners page, the sponsors page on our website, and we've got English exam prep for you. So it's an IELTS preparation system for you to help your clients. So we're going to take a look at the education requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program in detail, because this is one of the streams where there actually is a minimum education requirement. And it is something that might be tested on in your real ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So we're going to go over this in detail, and then if anything like this comes up in your exam, you're going to have the tools to be able to handle any question like that. Okay, so as we saw, there is a minimum requirement of a high school diploma. The tricky part is that that diploma has to be Canadian. Or if the diploma is from another country, the person needs to have an ECA. Now, an ECA is an Education Credential Assessment. So remember, there are only specific groups that can conduct this ECA. And what this does is it verifies the Canadian equivalent. So if a person graduates from a high school in South Africa, let's say, that person would at a minimum have to get an ECA done, and that ECA would have to come back positive and say that yes, this high school diploma, for example, is the equivalent of a Canadian high school diploma. If the ECA comes back negative and says, no, this diploma is not the same as a Canadian diploma, then this person doesn't meet the minimum requirements of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now, an interesting little piece that might come up with regard to this area of the Federal Skilled Worker Program has to do with a person's occupation and the education that they need in order to practice in that occupation. So in this case here, a person who is applying under an occupation that is regulated. So just like all of you are studying to be members of the ICCRC, being an immigration consultant is of course a regulated profession, and many other regulations are, professions are regulated as well. So what that person would have to do, of course, is have the credentials to work in this profession. Now those credentials would have to be Canadian, or if those credentials are foreign credentials, that person would need an ECA, and the ECA would have to come back with a little bit more detailed results than the previous example that we saw. So they would have to verify that the person can practice his or her profession in at least one province in Canada where those equivalency assessments are recognized. So if a person is working as an accountant, for example, in his or her country and has the credentials to do this, because maybe it's illegal to work as an accountant without certain credentials in certain countries, now that person would need to have an ECA with regard to those credentials. And those credentials would have to transfer over to a Canadian equivalent, proving that that person can work as an accountant, let's say, in at least one Canadian province. Okay, so that covers the educational area of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Let's take a look at the experience area, because remember, there are three big things that can be tested on in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. One is language, which is pretty straightforward. One is education, which has a couple tricky little areas that we saw. And of course, one is experience. Now, experience plays a role in pretty much every immigration stream, every economic immigration stream, and the Federal Skilled Worker Program is no different in this. So as we've seen in all of the previous lessons, when we're judging a person's experience, we have to think of two big things. Now, of course, we have to think of their time in there and the role. We're going to see that the Federal Skilled Worker Program is unique in terms of the experience required in time. So let's jump ahead and really analyze that section. So when we're looking at the Federal Skilled Worker Program in terms of time, the one part that really jumps out that is different from any other economic immigration stream is that the work experience minimum requirements must have been continuous. Now that means that the 1 year has to have been continuous. In this one as well, just like the Federal Skilled Trades Program and the Canadian Experience class are different, this one is different as well in terms of the amount of experience they need to meet at a minimum. So for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the person has to have 1 year of continuous experience over the last 10 years before applying. So this might not seem like much experience in order to meet the minimum requirements, but remember that in terms of CRS points, when you go ahead into the express entry procedures, if a person doesn't meet the CRS cutoff, they won't be selected, even if they meet the minimum requirements. Okay, so when we're looking at those 12 months of work, full-time means 30 hours per week for 12 months. And remember that that has to be 12 continuous months in order to meet that minimum of 1 year experience. If the person worked part-time, that would have to be 15 hours per week for 24 continuous months. Of course, if a person works 100 hours a week, it doesn't reduce the amount of time that is needed. So if a person works, let's say, 60 hours per week for 6 months, that doesn't mean he worked for a year. Okay, here's a point we'll take a look at in a minute again, and that is that simultaneous periods of work experience, as some people have more than one full-time job, that would only be counted as one occupation. And of course, just like everything else, if the person was in Canada for this work experience, it has to have been authorized. Now here is a tricky little area that we should discuss in case it ever comes up on your exam. And that is, of course, what if a person has two jobs at the same time? So remember that working full-time means working 30 hours per week. For a lot of people, they work way more than 30 hours a week. They might work 30 hours per week at one job and 30 hours a week at another job. So let's use that as an example. And let's pretend that a person here worked as an accountant Monday through Friday from 8 to 4 every day, and then had a second job working as a carpenter from Monday through Friday, 4 o'clock until midnight. So in this case here, he has a knock A and a knock B position, and only one job and one period of time would count for this. So it would be either the work as an accountant or the work as a carpenter. Let's dig a little bit deeper here and take a look at the role requirements in the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So let's carry on a little bit deeper into the experience requirements for people immigrating under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So of course knock plays a role in helping the officer analyze whether or not the person did the work that he or she had the title for. Remember that, of course, when we're looking at time, the person has to have performed one continuous year of knock OAB work experience. And that, of course, has to be according to the relevant knock description. Just like in some of the other streams we looked at, the person has to have performed the actions described in the lead statement for the occupation, and of course a substantial number of the main duties in the knock. The big difference is here. So this is where the Federal Skilled Worker Program, or another area where the Federal Skilled Worker Program is different from the Canadian Experience class, as we saw, and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. Now, for a Federal Skilled Worker's work experience, when they're looking at the duties this person performed, the person doesn't have to meet the employment requirements of this. Now, remember that the employment requirements are, of course, the degrees that a person needs in order to get that position, usually, the licenses that they need, etc. Don't get tricked by this, though, because remember that if a person's been working as, let's say, a teacher for 20 years, and the person doesn't have a degree or a teaching license or anything like that, yes, in this part here, the officer would look at the work experience and not take a look at the lack of a teaching license. However, when they look at the person's application as a whole, of course, and they're looking at especially the ability of the person to integrate into a Canadian workforce, that's going to play a really big role. And the person would likely not be able to work in Canada because he or she doesn't have a teaching license. This is, of course, different as well from the Federal Skilled Trades Program, as we saw. So with the Federal Skilled Trades Program, we saw in the other lesson, or if you haven't seen that lesson yet, you'll probably take a look at it later, that if a person needs to have a license or registration or certification or anything like that in the place where they're working in order to conduct their skilled trades work, then if they worked without that license, that work experience would not count in their application. However, in the Federal Skilled Worker Program, the work experience still counts. Okay, so of course the work that this person did has to be their primary occupation. And here is another interesting little tidbit when you dig into the regulations. Now, if a person puts their NOC in job experience in as the wrong role, so maybe they had a certain title but didn't perform that work, or maybe they performed certain types of work but they didn't put the appropriate title in their application, the officer won't take a look and figure out a better solution for them. Instead, he would reject it, of course. And this also helps you to see really where an RCIC plays a role in helping your clients. So if a person puts the wrong NOC description in his or her duties, then the officer would reject it. He wouldn't take a look at other NOC descriptions that better fit the work that the candidate did. All right, so thanks for tuning in again. You have 3 simulation questions to work through now. And of course, make sure that you read through those important websites that are linked just below this video as well. And remember, of course, you're going to have another lesson on the Federal Skilled Worker Points System. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson here, and I hope you have a better understanding, of course, of the Federal Skilled Worker Program. You're probably going to work with this quite a bit, actually, once you start working as an RCIC. So it's really an important area to know in terms of your exam, of course, and of course in terms of your future work life. All right, so thanks for tuning in again, and we'll talk when you work on the next group of videos.